Hello, everyone. Oh. Are you all sure? Hello? Okay, hola. What? Huh? Oh, very good. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so this is our second presentation for the day. Maybe some of you have just joined, and so then it's your first presentation of the day. My name is Nikisha Elena Alexis. I'll say a little bit more about me, and I will be co-presenting. Jamie and I will be jointly presenting on the topic of the spirit of change. I always begin my presentations by acknowledging the land on which we are seated. Jamie and I are coming to you from the land of the Potawatomi and Miami people, called Elkhart, Indiana currently. And I just want to acknowledge the vast number of indigenous tribes on whose land we are on. I got this from the Travel Portland website, and one of the things that they note is that although these different groups, and I don't want to say the names incorrectly, have been here for thousands of years, it only took 7 years to completely displace them from their territories. I'll introduce myself, and Jamie will introduce himself, and then he will lead the presentations. Again, my name is Nikisha Elena Alexis. I am, it's a long title, the Intercultural Competence and Undoing Racism Coordinator at AMBS. I'm originally from Trinidad. I was telling the folks downstairs who prepared our wonderful lunch that my grandfather was actually Venezuelan. I came to US to New York City, and somehow the Lord saw it fit to deposit me in Elkhart, Indiana, where I have been for 21 years. We fought about it for 7 of those. And I've been doing my work for about 20 years, so in some form or another at least. I actually began doing anti-racism work thanks to my 9th grade history teacher, who had us read A People's History of the United States, which he had us purchase from a communist bookstore without telling us. And we read it next to the state textbook, which was the Genius. And I have a lot of interests, including how racism, and how we deal with other animals relates to each other. That's a separate presentation. You can talk to me afterwards. I like to just, I won't go through all of this, but to just situate myself where I'm coming to these conversations from. I am a child of God, and I labor in this life under the labels of Black woman, immigrant. I am in a privileged gender identity. I am economically middle class currently. So that affects how I engage my landscape, the things that I'm very sensitive to, and also the things I have had to learn about in my own journey. I believe this work is important wherever you go. You're never going to go somewhere where there is not culture. You're never going to go somewhere, at least in this iteration of how we have organized society, where race is not part of the dynamic. And I believe it's part of how we engage with God's work in the world to do this work. It's not separate. I like to warn people, you're probably going to be uncomfortable at some point for some reason, not the same as the person sitting next to you with the topics that I talk about. And so I just expect people to manage their discomfort well, and we can talk about it. And I don't promise a safe space. I have stopped using that language. I will be intentional as much as I can with my words, and I invite you all to do the same. And if there's something that I've said that feels uncomfortable or you have a question about, I'm happy to engage in a respectful dialogue around it. And liberation for everybody in a body deserves to be free, is how I orient my life. I'll turn it over to Jamie to introduce himself.
Thanks. Well, I've met many of you already, but again, I'm Jamie Pitts, and I am originally from Texas. I was born in Houston and grew up mostly in Austin. Went to the University of Texas there in Austin. And in Texas, my father's an Episcopal priest, so I grew up in the Episcopal Church, a church that was strongly influenced, especially the youth group, by the charismatic movement. And my church had close connections with a non-denominational charismatic church. And by the time I got to college, I had followed several of my friends who had graduated already and gone to the University of Texas. I followed them into this charismatic college ministry, which really shaped my life deeply for several years. But I had a deep desire to, I'll tell a story. I told this to, many of you know Casey. I'm staying with Casey and Liz, and we were comparing a story because he grew up Pentecostal. So I told him this morning this story. I was at the back of the church during a service with my friend Jeff and several other friends, and Jeff was always known as very radical. He would do 40-day water fasts, and he was praying, as he often did, for fire from heaven, come on, fire from heaven. And I just thought, what is he talking about? What is he actually praying for? What does he mean? And in that, I wouldn't say in that moment, but as I thought about that, I realized that I was in a context that did not value careful reflection on the language we use as Christians and the history of the language we use. Where does that language come from? Yes, ultimately, hopefully at least, it comes from the Bible, but there's a lot of space between the Bible and us in terms of how we interpret, how we make sense of, how we use biblical language, biblical terms, images, and so forth. And I had a real hunger to reconnect, or to connect in some ways personally for the first time. So that led me to Fuller Seminary out here on the West Coast, down in Southern California, where I studied for 3 years, met Mennonites, became one, and then did a PhD in Scotland. I lived in Scotland for 5 years, studying at the University of Edinburgh, writing a dissertation on Mennonite theology. And I was hired from that program into AMBS, and I've been at AMBS as the professor of Anabaptist studies, which includes history and theology. I'm a theologian. I teach a lot of history, so I've learned to use and integrate history deeply into my theological work. So I want to say a couple things about kind of how I approach theology and how that will shape some of what I'm doing with you before I get into this material. So as those of you who are in my first session would notice, I am concerned with how the language we use as Christians is rooted in and shapes and contributes to and emerges from all of those things. All of those terms mean something slightly different. They all matter. How our theology is rooted in, I don't remember the order I did this in, but the rooted in comes from, emerges from, shapes, contributes to our ordinary life as Christian disciples. So I care deeply about academic theology and publishing. I direct the research center at the seminary. But I write books that are academic theological texts that are not everybody's cup of tea. But my heart and the reason I do theology and what I'm aiming for in the publications I put out, whether they're my own or others, is again to help us as a community together reflect on how the language we use contributes to, emerges from, shapes, all of those good things, our common life as disciples. Another commitment is that I seek to be an integrative thinker. So when we talked earlier this morning, I tried to talk about how, let's say Blaine mentioned the Quaker tradition that they had come from. And in that tradition, they described how there was this, in the unprogrammed, or is it unprogrammed or non-programmed? Unprogrammed. There's this individual waiting on the Spirit and openness to the Spirit. It's a little bit different than this kind of the way Mennonites tend to talk about a kind of a communal experience of the Spirit. I see a real gift in the Quaker expression and development, and I want to honor that gift, honor the difference from the Mennonite, and be able to name that difference. And some of the work that Nikisha is going to take us through, I think, is really foundational for being able to name difference. That's something that many of you, especially are like me, who are white male Americans or white in general, it creates a lot of tension. That tension Nikisha was naming, to name some of the differences. We want everyone to feel comfortable in a world that suits us very well. And especially if we have some tension with that, maybe we know that's not the best. Maybe we want, in theory, we're committed to a world in which everybody can belong and belong on terms that they have a say in and accept and feel good about. But until we really go deep and think about and dialogue and interact to learn what that looks like, it can be very easy for those of us who benefit from these systems to want to minimize and strategize around trying to make everybody feel really good about being in their place. And so my understanding of integration is open to naming difference and sitting with these tensions at the same time as we try to honor the best of what we learn from each other and aim at a shared community life and shared language and languages as people of faith. And the last thing I'll say is that my understanding about that, the role of theology, the history of teaching about the history of the church and so forth, this is not just to make us better Christians in a kind of generic sense, but I've used this language throughout my presentations of commitment to the healing liberation of God in Christ through the Spirit. And I do think reading Scripture, learning from Anabaptist history and other strands of the Christian tradition, we can be invited into an understanding of God's work that highlights the freedom from systems like white supremacy that we'll be talking about today, and our work as Christians. Fundamental to our Christian faith is being part of resistance to and challenging these systems. It's not kind of like, oh yeah, we've got our Christian faith over here and our kind of social commitments over here. It's actually, those are at their heart. So I'm going to say really briefly, I'll cover the kind of top part. These first three things are under discerning the Spirit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Spirit movements, how we might think about what the Spirit does, and how we look at those movements for change, those movements for transformation according to and towards the goal of that healing liberation. How do we see what the Spirit is doing? I'll talk about organizations. I think I missed a word there, but organizations, movements, and change. Where do organizations contribute to that work? And then I'm going to ask briefly just, what does this matter? And again, I put Portland Mennonite Church here. I know we've got at least 3 different churches represented here, and so you can fill in your own church there. Nikisha will then be talking about some kind of basic concepts when we're strategizing around organizing for change, thinking about the church as a strategic contributor, at times potentially a leader in that work, and what change looks like in practice. So that's where we're going to be going. So, do you want to speak to this? This is your slide here.
I just invite everyone, whenever I'm presenting, to set an intention for how you want to be here. It's after lunch. Some of us want to take a nap. You may know what some of our triggers are, words we hear that make us uncomfortable. Just decide in the moment how you want to engage and just hold to that, so that we're entering the space with thoughtfulness. And I think that's it. Yeah.
So yeah, what does it mean to discern the Spirit in a way that orients us towards God's work of healing liberation? I should pause there to say, when I say healing liberation, I'm trying to bring 2 kind of domains or areas of thinking about the work of God together. The root of salvation, that concept of salvation, is healing. And so one, I think, prominent biblical, theological way that we can embrace, I hope we can embrace, to think about what God's work in the world looks like is healing. God saves us through healing us. Another core concept or image is liberation, freedom. Freedom from bondage, literal bondage. Think about the Exodus, and sin. And sometimes it's tempting to think of sin as the spiritual reality over here and then the bondage over here, but often in the biblical writings, these are seen as overlapping. Sin is that which creates bondage, actual social, political structures that keep people in bondage. They're not totally reducible to one another, but they strongly, heavily overlap. And so I like to use that language of healing liberation to keep both of those ideas of how God is present among us together. So how do we discern the Spirit as we seek to join that work of healing liberation? Well, when we look at the world, there's a lot of things that are changing all the time. So how do we tell, how do we get behind one change versus the other? There's an infinite potential of possibilities for change that we could join. So why put our time, energy, resources, our prayers and hopes behind one kind of change versus another? This I'm going to preview a little bit if some of you are interested in discussing my book, Organizing Spirit, with me later this afternoon. Some of what I'm about to say comes from one of the chapters in that book, so I'll say more about that later. And this also draws on some of the strains from the biblical material I talked about in my morning session. But one of the ways that we can get at this question of what change, if we are trying to aim at joining in the Spirit, joining what the Spirit is doing, then the basic question we can ask is, who is the Spirit? What does the Spirit do? And one of the ways that, all that, if we think about how Spirit language is used in the Old Testament, those prominent images of wind, breath, and Spirit that I talked about, or in the New Testament, the way all that imagery is then developed in relation to Jesus and the church, I see kind of three prominent themes, and there could be others, but these are just three that really stand out to me, I think, that are useful. When we're trying to discern, well, what's going on? Where's the Spirit in all of this? How can we join the Spirit? We see that the Spirit is creating complexity. So one of the things I love about Genesis chapter 1 is when God creates, God doesn't just create, God doesn't keep all the formless stuff formless. God creates by differentiating. God creates difference. Difference is rooted in God's abundant love, and it's part of the goodness of creation. And so our orientation towards difference, now obviously differences can go in all sorts of different directions, but from my perspective, a Spirit kind of perspective on difference orients us as a starting place towards affirmation, towards blessing, to see complexity, to see differentiation and difference as gift rather than threat. The second theme is life. So the Spirit is strongly associated with life, with just the existence of life itself. As I said this morning, breath is a gift of God, and so we as human beings can receive that breath as a gift and enjoy that breath as a gift, one that we share with all living creatures. And so receiving breath, receiving life as a gift, orients us to support life for all creatures, orients us against those forces that deal death, against those forces that restrict life and seek to take life from some so that others, usually like people who are similar to those who are doing the death dealing, so that they can enjoy a kind of monopoly of life, whereas others have a kind of marginal life at best. So orientation towards life. Genesis 1 is a great, the first chapters of Genesis, I will say, are great indicators here. I also talked about Ezekiel 37, the story of Ezekiel's prophecy to the dry bones. This is another story in which life, the Spirit's strong association with life, comes out. And as I said earlier, again, it's not just life in itself, even though we do see a blessing and affirmation of life in itself in all its diverse complexity. At the same time, we see a kind of special association between the life-giving Spirit and the formation of the people of God who are to be a blessing for all of creation. And so there's, always in biblical literature, there's this kind of double, complex, two-sided relationship between the election, the particular and the cosmic, the universal of what God does. And so in Ezekiel, it's 37, you see the giving of life to God's people, the renewal of God's people, not just so that God's people can kind of live by themselves and everybody else dies, but rather as a means of renewing the entire creation. This orients us to a commitment to solidarity, a solidarity of all creatures. To see ourselves as a community of inspirited life leads us to respect, to listen, to come alongside, to receive accompaniment, and to work together. So this is a practice of justice seeking within a community of solidarity, which we commit to seeking one another's goods alongside each other. So those are some of the pointers I think that it's helpful, and I'm having to abbreviate this obviously quite a bit, but I think if we study carefully how the Holy Spirit appears, acts, what the Spirit does within Scripture, these are three prominent themes that can guide us when we think, okay, what kind of changes are going on? Well, are those changes supportive of, are they participating in God's blessing of the complex diversity of creation as good? Are they resisting forces of death in support of life? Are they generating solidarities among diverse creatures, including diverse humans, but not limited? We often, to a large degree rightly, associate the Holy Spirit with movement. There's, that wind, breath. These are movement kind of imagery. And so it makes a lot of sense that we think about the Spirit and change and movement. The Spirit blows where it will. So the blowing, unpredictable, willful Spirit, we follow. We move, we change to follow the Spirit. Those associations are quite appropriate. And in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, it's become common then to relate the Holy Spirit to what we call social movements. So change movements. And there's a lot of different ways of defining these, and I know we have a sociologist here, so I'll say this with care. But in a given society, there may be a variety of kind of forces that tend towards stability within that social order. A movement can occur to transform, to change that society, to disrupt the stability. A movement can also come to, counter that disruption, to try to preserve at least the perception of what is a stable order. We tend to use social movements, those people who talk about movements, tend to talk about movements and associate them with movements that they like. So the environmental movement or the peace movement or something like that. But kind of to using movement language more descriptively, MAGA is a movement. The Tea Party was an earlier movement. So there are conservative movements as well, reactionary movements that try to posit a kind of stable order, even if sometimes they're very creatively inventing what they see as the stability, and then trying to organize, mobilize to protect or preserve or create that order that they want. My point is the language of social movements doesn't necessarily line up with the political ideology. Movements happen in societies. And there's been a temptation then, because of this kind of blurring between, movements are great, We love movements. That's where God is. That's where the Spirit is. Because we tend to use the language of movements to describe things that we like, politics we like, it's then really easy to link Spirit and movements. But the challenge then is when there's other movements that don't seem to line up with what we like. Well, it's a movement, so it must be part of the Spirit, because the Spirit moves, right? So we need to, well, and I use this, the second line is about the new social movements. And again, so it was sociological language in the 1960s and 70s to describe the many different movements that grew up at that point. I mentioned peace, environmental movement, the second wave of the feminist movement in North America, the gay liberation movement, the Native American movement. There's a variety of these movements that, although they're not all identical politically, and some of them went in quite different political directions, they tend to have a kind of general, they inhabit, or they are at least perceived to inhabit, a general ideological area, and to share that. So often when we talk about, yeah, we really like those movements, that's the kind of movements we're talking about. But again, there's other movements that we need to discern. Whatever movement that we're connecting with, we need to discern those movements in relation to the Holy Spirit, is my suggestion. And I think, let me just make sure this is, yeah, oh no, okay. Just trying to get my bearings here. So I'll just say briefly, and again, this is for those interested in these kind of conversations, this is what we'll be going deep into in the second part of this afternoon when I talk about my book, Organizing Spirit. Often when we privilege the language of movements, as valid as that is, as valid as that association is, because again, we have many reasons to connect spirit to change, to movement. But we can sometimes then devalue the role of organizations in contributing to movements that are oriented, we hope, and at their best, to that work of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, so organization is just a descriptive term that can be used to talk about any sort of kind of pattern of social interaction. How do we organize? You know, this could be in a very small family. How do you organize the way you spend your time? How do you organize space in a shared household? Organization can be used to talk about the organization of a multinational corporation or a government. Organizations, plural, can, typically we use that language to talk about, again, a wide variety of kind of ways of interacting and relating to one another. But sometimes we associate organizations with only certain of those patterns. And I'm particularly interested in this question of institution and institutions, because I've heard over and over again in the Mennonite world, but beyond, that because the Spirit is associated with movements, because the Spirit blows where it will, then the Spirit is not in the institutions. And institution is a kind of organization, and I worry that if we disassociate or if we reject the idea that the Spirit could be working in our institutions or around our institutions, or that our institutions, if we deny that our institutions could be used towards Spirit ends or goals, then we can get into some unhelpful places, particularly when we think about an organization like Portland Mennonite or Ministerios de Restauración, particularly when we think about organizations like Mennonite Church USA or Pacific Northwest Conference. If these organizations can't in some way, even though they are complex endure across long periods of time, have budgets, all these kinds of things that we tend to associate with institutions. If we can't talk about that relative stability that institutions offer as a potential contributor to the work of the Spirit in sparking movements for change that generates solidarity among creatures, then we should probably just leave. We should probably, maybe the local community can participate in the Spirit, but get out of MCUSA, get out of Northwest Conference, because what's the point? But maybe we can actually use some of that institutional and other kinds of organizational resources to pursue the movement goals of change movements that are, again, oriented towards the solidarity of life among creatures. And so Nikisha's going to expand on this quite a bit. I'm not going to get into the details, but I want you to be thinking as we transition here, where do you see, and again, if you're at other churches, Ministerios Restauración, I can't remember the other Mennonite church, Salem Mennonite Church is here, or Portland. What is the spirit of your organization? So here I'm using little s. And I had on the previous slide, I had a picture of Vincent Harding, and I spoke about his story last night some, and he liked to use playfully, I think, in his historical writings about the Black freedom struggle. He would speak about the spirit, the little s spirit of movements, those particular movements oriented towards liberation and healing for Black people in this world. He liked to kind of playfully combine that language of the spirit of those movements with the divine spirit, not to identify, to say they're simply the same, but to show how they could line up, that the spirit of those movements could join in the work of the divine spirit. And Harding thought that institutions, such as churches, such as seminaries, such as publishing houses, and all sorts of other kinds of institutions, could be movement institutions, could be freedom institutions that actually contribute to the work instead of just being seen as opposed. And so, does your organization have the same kind of spirit like Harding is talking about, that could line up with, aim at, attempt to join in the movement of the Holy Spirit? What is the spirit of your organizations? How would you, if you reflected, how would you name that spirit or the spirits of your organization? Are they dedicated to the things of the Spirit, or do they have other allegiances? And then from there, you can start taking stock of, who do we have here? How can we, as we are, who we are, work together, aim together, respond to that gracious invitation to join in what the Spirit is doing? Who is not here? Do we need to actually go out from here and join in with some other people? Are there people that we could invite? What kind of material resources, money, land, that we could use, again, to contribute to this movement work? What structure and structures do your churches have? And I'm talking about committees. We don't really theologize our committees. So why have them? Are they purely pragmatic? Yeah, of course, to some large degree They just help us get stuff done. But for what? For what purpose? Can our committees, can the structure of a church actually be useful to helping us get to where we want to go? Or is it just kind of, to be honest, as much as I love my church, sometimes it just feels like we've had these committees for 50 years. We're not going to change them. We just have to have them. It's how somebody else decided a long time ago, and that's what we do. I hope we're not stuck in that way that I've seen some churches, including my own, get stuck. At the same time, as I hope we're also not overlooking some of the potential that the committee structure and other kinds of structures in our churches have for our contribution to movements for change. So I'm going to stop there, and Akisha's going to kind of get into a whole lot of stuff that I think connects with what I'm talking about here. So I'll just ask you, what is the spirit of your organization?
Thank you so much, Jamie. And actually, I don't always like rhetorical questions, so I'm going to have you all be in pairs or trios, and I'll set my timer, and we'll take 3 minutes to answer that. What is the spirit of PMC? If you are on a committee, what is the purpose of your committee? Does it feel purposeful or sort of rote? We'll just take 3 minutes, and if you're in pairs, make sure each person gets 1.5 minutes. I'll flag y'all, and then I'll get into my time. Okay, you're at 1 minute and 19 seconds, so if somebody else hasn't spoken, give them a chance. I'll add 1 more minute. I can add 1 more minute. Okay, I gave you all a whole extra minute. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. So I'm going to pick up on the practical piece of how this then holds together. And I did work with the Sanctuary of Belonging Committee and the Racial Justice Committee earlier this morning, so you will see some repeat material here. But if the spirit of change, there is prompting, guidance, leading, hints of God's Spirit, then what does it mean to join in? And in very practical terms, what does that look like? How do we participate in change? And it turns out there are helpful ways to do that and less helpful ways to do that, as you can imagine. I just want to start with a couple of foundational concepts that people have seen before. What do we mean by change? What is it that we are asking of ourselves and of others? And I like in my work, again, I do intercultural competence and undoing racism work. I like to talk about my work like space travel. I'm not a Trekkie. I'm going to mess this up. I am asking, I'll say it this way, my work became easier in one regard and more enjoyable when I began to think of it this way. I am asking myself and others when I go into a space to go from one planet that makes a lot of sense and the gravity works and they know what the air smells like. I am asking them to go from that planet. I'm critiquing that planet and asking them to go to a planet that none of us have actually been to in full, but that I trust is there, and I need us to make that leap. You're not gonna win somebody from one planet to another with a couple Facebook posts. You cannot do a sermon series and think that that's gonna get somebody from the planet of white dominance and oppression to some planet that I trust is there, but none of us have been to. And indeed, where the gravity and everything works, opposite to what they are used to. And when I started thinking about it from that perspective, I started having a lot more patience, and I started having a lot more strategy. I asked myself, what is the type of spaceship I'm gonna have to build to get you off of the planet of white supremacy, which I now call white delusion, to a planet where we are all, including the delusionists, are free and healed. So that's what I'm bringing in the background. I'm trying to help people jump planets. And because I think of this as space travel and that we're on different planets, I have come to see that just because we have the same inputs doesn't mean that the outputs are going to be the same. So many of us, I did not watch, but many of us can watch a video of George Floyd and literally see A and B, and I'm coming out at C, and somebody else is coming out at H. And the twain shall not meet. Different planets means different logics, means different interpretations. How do I build a spaceship that can get your A and B and my A and B to be C? How do I translate your H into something else? And so I use this analogy with the folks in the morning session, And I said, if a group of people who don't know how to bake bread sit around in a circle and try to bake bread, they'll probably figure out how to do it after some very extensive trial and error and some poor tasting bread, and you might actually make pizza or something instead. You're going to be all over the place. So what my job is people call in a bread maker. Call the consultant. Organizations can help you do the thing that the Spirit is prompting you to do. Right? Like, if you call a baker, you will move much faster in this process. I'm a baker. Only metaphorically. I do not bake bread. Okay? So the phrase that came up to me as Jamie and I were thinking through our work together was Spirit prompts, Spirit guides, Spirit inspires. Spirit is that sort of sense when you know that something is this way or that way, right? Like, Spirit can be that. Or, Jamie gave some good handles around it values complexity, it values life, it values solidarity across differences, including big differences, right? Spirit can prompt. Passion can motivate. I meet a lot of passionate people. Passionate people are motivated. They're often resilient. Passionate people can be in struggle for a long time. But if you have spirit and you have passion, but you don't have skill and strategy, you're going to be led and passionate and burnt out. You're going to be led and passionate and not effective. And so, I feel like I've heard often in Mennonite circles, which I used to actually say out loud, and I'm so glad that transformation is possible. As long as we're faithful, it doesn't matter if we're effective. Anabaptists love that one. As long as we're faithful, we'll let God do the rest. And that is true. But that's not an excuse to be unskilled and unstrategic and ineffective. So often what is missing in my work is skill and strategy. And we need a lot of skill and strategy, particularly in the time that we're in. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about the fact that we are living in a dictatorship 1.0. I mean, we're there. If you think we're not there, we can talk about it, but we're there. We're not irretrievably there, but if things continue in the way that they are, we could land there for a long time. Skill and strategy are super necessary. It's not only okay to just be faithful and do a lot of activities and not know how the activities are actually leading to something transformative or not, either internally or externally. The times have always called for something more substantive, but especially now. And I like to say honestly, and this is a new thought for me, biblically there is strategy. I used to read this text from Matthew 10 very differently about being wise as serpents or shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. If you look at Matthew 10, he is preparing the disciples for repression. He's preparing the disciples to be able to know what they will say when they are called to account by systems and structures that want to see them done away with. Matthew 10 is a pretty intense chapter. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I encourage you to read it. It is very, very it feels close to where we are right now. And it's in this context that Jesus invites the disciples to be wise as serpents or shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. And the more that I have leaned into strategy in my work, I'm like, this makes a lot of sense. When does it make sense to be close to the ground, hidden, fast-moving, able to transform, shed skin, new skin, regularly? When does it make sense to be high up in the sky, very, very visible, flying around, and looking like you're not doing anything at all when you are? I love it. I think it's we like in these times. When does it make sense to put it very concretely, at the protest, waving the flag? When does it make sense to be not doing any of that, but have people in your basement? The times don't always call for the two things. And some people who are doing one thing, probably for the sake of safety, should not be doing the other thing. So, I have been working with churches around this, like, choose. Are we in serpent mode, or are we doves right now? Does it make sense for the church to put an ad in the newspaper that says, "We welcome immigrants," and sign all your names? It might not be the right time for that. That was actually an idea. I'm very glad that somebody said no to that. So strategy is also not alien from spirit, especially if we think spirit is represented as a dove. Be innocent and visible and doing some subversive things. So I also happen to believe, and I only have a few more slides and we'll get into conversation, that church, and I'm trying not to say the church, because the church is sort of really, it just feels too stuffy. We are church, and church changes and transforms. I really believe that church is very strategic, and particularly in these times, but I think across a variety of times when movement and change are needed. Why? The church has organizational and logistical and spirit-informed power to organize and resist. There are not a whole lot of places that people are volunteering to come every week to hear from leaders that they trust and respect, who have a lot of say and influence on how we live our lives. I mean, there really aren't. Folks are doing Twitch. I don't use Twitch, I'm sorry. Okay, right? Like, there's not, depending on, and churches are different, so I'm not saying that this is the same for every church, but some of the things that we can use to our advantage are like, y'all have property and access to property that you have some autonomy over. You're still currently you're still currently tax exempt, right? Like, they are not threatening. They're threatening to remove nonprofit status from a lot of places. Churches are not one of them. You have some independent decision-making bodies, right? Like, you all can make decisions as a body together. You have communication channels that are germane to you all, newsletters, phone numbers, church directories, all of these things that seem very ordinary in ordinary times that are actually really powerful tools in times when their movement is needed for change and healing liberation. You have financial resources, you have budgets, you have bank accounts, you have certain protections currently. And this might seem like really simple, but I can't tell you the amount of pastors and church leaders that I have encountered, particularly in the last 2 years, and certainly since last November, that sort of are in this really weird, kind of resigned, emotionally kind of paralyzed, quote unquote, place. And I'm just like, you all are sitting on a gold mine of opportunity here. Not everybody's running around with a building that they can do things with. not everybody's running around with social and institutional networks that they can actually tap into that currently are not monitored in the same way that, say, Harvard University is. What do we mean where we feel hopeless? This is not a thing that computes for me. We have too many resources at our disposal for that to be the attitude, understand it as I might from time to time. So church has a strategic position, not only in terms of spirit, but also in terms of actual tangible strategic tools. I think this is my last section, and then we'll open up for conversation. But change in practice. So we have tools. What are certain ways that we might practice change from a strategic and scaled perspective? I shared this with the group this morning. I call this the 4 quadrants of change. I have not seen anybody talk about this way. I kind of came up with it after working with multiple congregations and organizations on undoing racism efforts. To explain it, the up and down arrow is charting things that are in the personal realm of action, where we're really dealing person to person. Underneath is systemic, where there are institutions and the social change. And the sideways ones are saying that individual and institutional change is often easier. You can often do it faster, but it often has a small impact, right? I can change individually. That's less impact than if this whole congregation begins to say, let's say anti-racism is a value that we all want to be engaged with. The other change is harder, it's slower, but it can have a bigger impact. So if you change relationally or you change socially, that's going to take a long time, but many things, big things can transform that way. Right? Like, I like to remind my clients sometimes, slavery was never meant to end. It's not like people are like, okay, we're just going to practice slavery for 25 years and then call it quits. I was never meant to be here. We were never supposed to relate this way. And that was the way it was designed by God. And so that was a massive social change, but it was slower and it was harder, but when the movement happened and some big things changed. And so often what I will find is people are doing relational activities and thinking that they're making institutional changes. Let's do a book study. I love book studies. Please don't hear me hating on book studies. I love book studies. How is your book study being positioned to change your institution? What are you reading? Do you know why? Is it something that you can implement to actually change the institution that you're in? If not, you might want to pick a different book or do something different altogether. So change in practice, one of the things it requires is that we understand that the activities we are doing, where it's actually impacting, and we choose accordingly. Again, that might seem very simple, but if it was, I would not have a job. Oftentimes, there is a mismatch between spirit, passion, intent, and the action that comes out of it. Another tool that I like to use is something that I came up with also because I was trying to identify why people were stuck in particular places within their organization. What was happening? And so what I kind of outlined was, okay, sometimes there are people who are informed. Become informed about an issue. We become informed about racism. We become informed about white supremacy. we become informed about patriarchy, our eyes are open. We feel led then to do something. When we feel led to do something, we might become very active. We're running around to everything. Every book study about patriarchy, we are there. There's a protest with the pink hats, we're there. We're doing all the stuff, right? But it's not clear what all my activity is leading to. I know I'm tired, but I'm not actually seeing anything shift. Organizations are notorious for this. We're doing a lot of stuff and we can't say what it's actually yielding. Many individuals, groups, and organizations get stuck in informed and activity, and very few cross over into becoming strategic and then effective. And strategy looks like I am choosing particular things because I know where they're going to take me and I know how they tie together, and I can see that they're effective at the end. I can actually notice the changes that are occurring. So, this is another, like, for yourself or for the places where you're at. Where are you? Are you informed? Are you active? Are you strategic, but you're not sure if it's working yet? And the arrow is that when we become effective, there's always something new to learn, and so then we need to become informed again. There's always some new version of nefariousness that shows up, and we need to learn more about it and go through this cycle repeatedly. The last tool that I'll sort of highlight is a piece of my work that I really love. It's the Intercultural Development Inventory. It is a way of learning about how interculturally competent we are, which is how do we deal with difference? Are we really afraid and just don't want to deal with difference? Do we like difference, but only when we have things in common? Are we able to adapt to difference in a way that is still authentic and true to who we are, so that I am an Anabaptist and I know what that is, but I'm also able to engage others who might have different expressions of that? Where am I with dealing with difference? This is a continuum, an assessment that can place you on the continuum so you have awareness and can grow that. The IDI is often talked about for individual growth. I love using it for movements and strategizing around movements. If you are in a context where there is an us versus them, and I'll give something very concrete, your most interculturally competent, effective move is to start talking about what you have in common. There are a lot of congregations that just don't want to talk about difference, and they think that that is going to resolve the issue, because if we don't talk about it and just talk about other things, hopefully we'll be fine. But really, you want to build a bridge around what you have in common, and then you go into some deeper discussion. You don't stay there. So a very concrete example of this is with marriage equality. Marriage equality is a minimization. It's what we have in common. Don't you want your marriage to be equal? I want marriage to be equal. Doesn't everybody wants marriage to be equal? Love wins is a minimization argument to deal with polarization, where it's like, well, my love is better than your love. Well, but love wins. Who wants love to fail? Right? Like, that was actually a strategic move to sort of to change the conversation between I am different than you and you are different than me, and so you should not have rights because you and I are different. So I find intercultural competence to be incredibly effective and very much underused for thinking about how we go about changing things, either in a small scale or in a big social scale. It's very underutilized. I'm not going to stay here too long, but I'll just say that a couple traps that block progress. One, focusing on resistance so much at the start. What's the first thing you see in that picture? You can say it out loud. You see the red arrow. Do you see all the little arrows going up against that red arrow? It takes a while to see that, right? But when we're trying to change stuff, the first thing we see is, oh, it's so hard. Or so-and-so is not going to like it. Or, we might lose that donor if we, right? The first place we go is the resistance. And really, we want to try to focus on where there's give in the system. Lack of a shared clarity, like sometimes we all think we know that we're going in the same way, what you're saying about discerning the Spirit, but like, have we actually sat down and collectively sort of said, like, what is the vision? What are you hearing? What are you hearing? Are we hearing the same things? What do we have in common with what we're hearing? What is different? How do we talk through what Spirit is doing? Like I said, lots of activity, but we're running around in circles. And a lot of passion, so many passionate people, but not necessarily a lot of skills. So I'm going to leave it there, just in terms of giving some practical handles. That's my area, and we'll open it up for questions and such. I hope we can go a little bit long because we started a little bit late, but thank you all so much for listening. I hope that this feels encouraging, and we'll open it up for dialogue and conversation. And I guess we can bring the microphone. And I'll just say, since we don't have a lot of time, if you can crystallize your comment or your question so that we can get as many as possible, that will be really important. So, Jamie, if you want to come up. Yeah. What questions or comments do you have?
I'm just thinking about what you just said about strategy, and also thinking what Jamie said about Spirit. And I'm wondering, where do Spirit and strategy sort of intersect, if that makes sense?
Coming out the gate with the hard questions. What is your name, sir? You're not allowed to ask any more questions for the rest of this time. I feel like they're in this moment on a Saturday in Portland. I might change my mind in Elkhart 2 days from now. I feel like they're really intertwined. You have to do a lot of listening to know what the right strategy is, and a lot of discernment to know what's the right thing to do, when to be a dove or when to be a serpent. Like, there's a lot of listening. And so strategy without Spirit, I think, can be very cold, and maybe have you doing strategy to do nefarious things, because I'm not operating with an understanding that we are Spirit first, and my enemy is Spirit first too. And Spirit without strategy, like I said, is, you can feel the leaning, but you might end up in an activity swirl and not actually really get to where God is actually calling you to be. So that's what I'm thinking of now, but what might you say?
Yeah, I had the benefit of a moment to contemplate this question while you talked, so thanks. Yeah, so if strategy is a kind of large-scale pattern of behavior, practice that we are committing to try to get to the goals that we set, then Spirit helps us clarify the nature of the goals. And so you can't get clear about what the strategy is going to be unless you're clear about those goals. But also, I think kind of maybe in line with what Nikisha's saying, as we listen to and discern together who the Spirit is, where the Spirit is leading us, how the Spirit is present among us at this moment, That can spark creativity. The Spirit can spark creativity. So I do think, if we get past the sort of dualism in which like organizations must be deadening because they're stable and all these kinds of things, and movements are fun and exciting, and we are able to open ourselves to see how the Spirit might be active in our organizations, then my hope is that, we see the possibilities for new life and transformation, creative change that can shape our strategies. And the last thing I'll say is, because I think kind of there is this typical pattern of activity that the Spirit engages in, and this is what I talked a lot about this morning, in relation to the way the Spirit shapes us to be like Jesus and follow Jesus' life and teachings. Those life and teachings contain strategic brilliance that kind of we can mine or learn from for the rest of our lives. And thinking about baptism or the Lord's Supper or sharing in community, in relation to these strategic questions. How does baptism sharpen our strategic imagination for belonging? What kind of communities, what kind of belonging do we need to have to form the kind of communities of solidarity that contribute to these movements? Well, does baptism? So the Spirit reminds us of these. That's part of what the Spirit does, is remind us of Jesus' teachings, according to Jesus in John's Gospel. So I think those teachings can be fertile ground for strategic imagination.
Hello? There we're on.
How do we corporately learn to discern the difference between the Spirit and tradition?
So you said you would corporately learn.
How do we?
Corporately learn
I see.
discern the difference between tradition and Spirit.
Okay. And what does the word tradition do for you? Can you tell us more about that?
Doing it because it's always looked like the right thing to do.
I see. Yeah, so how do we, recognizing that some of us may experience a ritual or a practice or a pattern of behavior in those terms that somebody else thinks, oh, I love that we do that. How do we talk together about kind of our experience, our different experiences around some of the practices that we inherit in ways that can kind of reorient us towards a shared experience in which our common practices give us life? I mean, I think one of it, back to the question of difference, is to recognize that, within a given community, there's going to be some stuff that some people just really love that other people don't. And those kind of differences are always going to be part of communities. And so working at difference, as Nikisha really wisely said. I want to take a class from you on intercultural development and social change. That's kind of blowing my mind to think about all that. But that, I think, also works in community development, which is a lot of what we have used it for. The seminary, at least, and I think a lot of church congregations use it for. How do we work at those differences? That's one aspect of it. But how do we open ourselves to the newness of what the Spirit is doing that may challenge some of those inherited patterns? I do think that's about an ongoing openness to renewing our imaginations for what the Spirit is doing, being able to ask those questions in an open-handed and open-hearted way about, how do the things we do, maybe especially the things we take for granted, how do those actually help us join in what the Spirit's doing? If we can ask that question in an open way, open-ended way, while also recognizing that we're going to come out, we're going to have some differences about that. And the solution is not necessarily to, just throw out everything or keep everything, but it's probably going to be some mix. But again, with the goal of creating practices, creating patterns of belonging and relating that help us all join together to pursue that healing liberation together with the Holy Spirit. I would hope it would get us some way towards that.
There are two things that are coming to me as in this moment. One is this is where diversity is actually really helpful, because we don't have to even ask questions about tradition, and oftentimes people don't until enough diversity comes that brings that question to the forefront. Why is it that we are doing this? If it is blocking the participation of other people, is it actually helpful? I tell new pastors, and I use this word intentionally, to exploit their newness. Ask about everything, even the things that you think you already know the answer to. Because that's not only for your learning, it also prompts the people in the system to ask and think and answer, wait, why is it actually that we do this? What does that actually mean? And you will find that sometimes an inordinate amount of people don't know. And so I feel like diversity can help bring that question of tradition, what is tradition and what is the Spirit doing? Because, if a congregation is all of a sudden seeing an influx of immigrants, or all of a sudden seeing an influx of people with mental health challenges, and then we're like doggedly committed to doing the thing the way that it always was, even though it prevents those people from participating, we might run into that this might be really about tradition and not really being able to engage with what God is doing new. So that's one of the things that's coming to mind, that diversity can actually really bring these questions to the forefront in a new way. And I forgot the other thing, so that the diversity thing seems like what it was supposed to be the answer. Other questions or comments, like if you heard something that was new for you or sparks a new thought, like you don't just have to ask us information, you have thoughts too.
I really wrestled over whether to raise my hand on this one, but I'm thinking about this phrase, four traps that block progress. And I'm thinking about Western thinking, Enlightenment thinking, and key hallmarks of Enlightenment thinking, progress and optimism and that kind of thing. And I wonder, that's recent, that's relatively recent in our history. And there's lots of cultures throughout time, and even now, that don't subscribe necessarily to a progress mindset necessarily. And what can we learn from them? Are they spirit-driven? And what can we, in the Western world, if you will, or the Western thinkers, learn from cultures and theologies that are not so progress and optimism minded? I don't know if that makes sense.
I'll just sit with that. I think it's a good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, ooh, say some more. Ooh, dialogue, yes.
Okay. I'm just thinking about enlightenment. I'm talking about the 1700s, 1600s kind of enlightenment thinkers for whom much of history had not been with a mindset of scientific thinking came out around that time and a little bit before, but this mindset of categorization and this is what we don't know, but now we do know this, and we're kind of framing our understanding of the world, and we're moving forward, and we're mechanizing, and we're creating these new systems. Capitalism was created, and that was better than what was before. Democracy was created, and that was better than what was before. This kind of movement forward of there's a better way, and there's always a better way. Is there? Is that God's intent? Is that God's way? Is it up to us to help the Spirit? Is it the Spirit really that's helping us? Is the Spirit making us think this way? Is that the kind of the way we should be? I guess I'm thinking about the kind of the progress-oriented, requiring skills. But what's the role of passion? I'm sorry, I'm rambling here, and I don't know fully what I'm saying.
You're opening up a big can of worms here in the last 3 minutes. I think what I feel in this moment is Spirit is not really trapped in that. You know, I asked Jamie while we were sitting here, I'll just put it out, is Spirit Christian even? Right, like if God's Spirit is breathed on everyone, then is Spirit just my container even? I mean, right, like, so there's something about being, I think, is what I'm drawing on, that like, I think focusing on the Spirit helps us return to being. Which enlightenment was really, I think, about doing and thinking and planning and all of that kind of thing. So I want to say that Spirit, it feels to me, takes me out of that trap a little bit by not thinking that it's just up to me. And I would say, you know, the skill and strategy piece, I don't see it as separate from passion, but I do think, like, in some way, common sense is not the right word, but, right, like if I'm passionate about something and I don't know what I'm doing, am I going to be able to do what it is that I want to do? Maybe I can figure it out, but it can be helpful to have somebody else who is practiced at it come alongside me and be in community for us to be able to do it together. So I think there's a way of thinking about skill that's really in that vein. And at the other hand, I think it's like, it's very, if I don't know how to do the thing, it serves me to learn how to do the thing, especially if there's something that I want to be creating out of that. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are some things that are just coming to mind.
I'll say briefly, I think we might think about progress in a couple different ways. One of them is what you're referring to. It's kind of large scale, history will improve, and we have all sorts of reasons to be skeptical of that, and that, you know, the Western world kind of lost faith in progress after World War II, after the two World Wars, and kind of embraced the skepticism, which to me can be reactionary. And one of the forms of that skepticism takes is, let's go back, let's return to a pre-modern kind of vision where there's these stable orders in which the patterns of domination are not challenged. I want to make progress on those patterns of domination, sorry. I'm not happy just to say, yeah, let's just get back in touch with the good rhythms of nature, blessing, you know, patriarchal rule or something like that. I actually want to make progress on some specific things, but progress around, confronting and undoing white supremacy, I think, is a quite different frame than this grand historical narrative of progress, in which the triumph of European civilization somehow will guarantee. To use a really concrete example, within my field of theology, there's a whole field called, or a whole discipline of liberation theology, which I think is really valuable. But some of the ways that liberation has been talked about are kind of in this enlightenment mode of like, if we just throw out over this political order, then we'll all be free, period. And that's the movement of history in this kind of grand optimistic pattern. In conversation with liberation theology, there's been some theologies in relation to African American or black liberation theology. Black women began to write what's sometimes called womanist theology. I think Nikisha was the first person I ever read doing the work of womanist theology, perhaps. But this work, it often highlights survival alongside liberation. Alongside. And that can be hard to understand. It took me a really long time to actually get that in many of these womanist writers. It's not to reject the possibility or the call to freedom, but it's to say sometimes freedom is hard work. And instead of just the kind of naive optimism that, yeah, if we just do this, we'll all be free, we can work at those practices of survival that oppressed communities have practiced for thousands of years. And Anabaptists know a thing or two about this as well. I think if we can avoid the kind of reactionary critique of the Enlightenment that pretends like if we just return to older patterns of domination and social order, then we'll be fine. We can maybe get out of some of that loop, but I'm losing coherence here as we go on, so maybe it's a good time to break. You want to say anything else?
Just thank you all for engaging. We have two more sessions. Jamie will be talking about his book, and I'll be talking about a project that we worked on together, the Benham West Project. We're here through tomorrow, so if you are not somebody that likes the microphone and there's something that you want to say, just feel free to approach us and we can engage. But thank you so much, and I hope that this was helpful.
Yeah, thank you all. And I'll just note that, in maybe 10 minutes, we'll come back for the book studies. Nikisha will be upstairs this time, and Jamie will be in the room downstairs. Yeah, there's coffee, some snacks left downstairs.